He's got life sentences that he's facing in Ocala, life sentences that he's facing in Hillsborough County. This case is about what he ought to pay for these crimes. Because as bad as that life of violence is, as bad as those judgments are, for what he's done before he ever got here, they pale in comparison to what he did in Gainesville, to what he did to Sonia, to what he did to Christina and Krista and Tracy and Manuel. Prison's simply not enough.
Danny Rolling was a classic psychopath. As you already noted, he had killed 3 in a brutal murder in Shreveport before he ever came here. We later determined, over a course of time determined, he'd also been a serial rapist in several states. Rolling, I mean, I've said this so many times in the past, he did it because he enjoyed it. He loved it. He loved the power of it. If Danny Rolling were out for one more day, he would do it again. It was what drove him. The way he would describe in such detail, and even tried to market, as you know, some articles in which he described in great detail the horrific acts that he perpetrated. He not only loved doing it, he loved reliving it. He told several, well, at least 2 that I remember specifically, inmates, he described in great detail what he had done. And it described kind of the sexual power that it gave him. And I mean, one of the most startling moments in the trial was probably when one of his fellow inmates, Rusty Benstead, it was suggested that Danny was exaggerating his sexual contact and the way that he had had contact with one of the victims. And Rolling's response had been, you know, when they think they might live, they'll do anything. And for me, Danny Rolling will always be kind of that nightmare that recurs. Every time I hear, as I just heard some of those voices of the family, I remember them as I hear some of this. And I remember trying the case on Court TV that many years ago. I still, from time to time, I still think about him, and it's just a profound sadness of what he did to such young lives. And think where they'd be today. They would be parents and possibly grandparents. They were graduating or just entering the University of Florida. Their children or grandchildren would be doing that. He was a monster. But the thing that was so amazing about Rolling was how he would come up with these excuses of these other personalities, or this kind of, that somehow he was a victim of his home life. He was of course, he shot his father in the head with a pistol, which should tell you something about him. Rolling was a monster. From time to time, those guys come along, and the randomness that your guest just talked about. Actually, that night, he had previously gotten ready. He was just about to pounce on another victim. We still will never know who that was, when someone came around the back door drinking and kind of bumped into him, and he ran off into the woods and ended up over where Sonia was, and the Powells and Larson were living, and that began the spree that went over as I was thinking about this sitting here, I guess next week will be, sadly, the anniversary of those deaths. He was the fun thing about Rolling, he could really change his look. He had this chameleon-like, he would kind of come into the courtroom sometimes looking kind of meek and mild, like he was just, very, and yet we know that the way he presented was anything but that. He was in control, and he was a monster, and it wasn't enough for him to kill. He kept them alive, and he tortured them, and their families had to live with that, and those who still remain still live with it, I'm sure.
A lot of us students had was a feeling of not being safe. The beginning of the fall semester was always such a joyous, celebratory time of year. And to have something like this happen, it just really puts it into a different focus. And it's almost like a loss of innocence, because when you're that age, when you're in your late teens, early 20s, you kind of think of yourself as invincible. You don't think of your mortality. But when you're hearing about something like this happening in your neighborhood to people who are your age, it makes you think about the fact that, oh my goodness, this can happen to me. And even after the person is caught, even after the initial terror subsides, you're still sort of looking over your shoulder. You're still sort of, turning on lights when you get home, thinking, is someone waiting for me? So it really had a really short-term and long-term mental and emotional effect on a lot of us.
Rod Smith, you prosecuted him. Was there anything positive that was taken away by law enforcement through the investigation and perhaps learning anything here that would help in the future? Was there any sort of silver lining in this horrific case?
Well, I think that certainly one of the things that I was proudest of being part of, we're divided over everything from time to time. I never saw a community come together anymore. And the law enforcement community, it wasn't whether it was the Gainesville Police or the Sheriff's Office or the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. It wasn't, it's our turn, it's what we're doing. It was always, what can we do? Great cooperation. It was incredible. I would say that for all of the participants, or for most of the participants at least, it was a great learning experience. I mean, we weren't talking about a case that was solved overnight. It was a long time before we were able to, and there were some missteps along the way, as you would expect. There was great pressure to find somebody, and there were missteps that were taken. But I think overall we learned a great deal about how to cooperate and the value of cooperation in law enforcement. I also thought that kind of on a side note, we made great progress in, we resisted releasing all of the photographs. The press sought them, the media sought them, both the legitimate media and some media was not so well intended. And we fought very hard in the courts to keep the idea that a family has privacy rights in the remains of their children and their loved ones. And later that resulted in the Dale Earnhardt bill, which was passed and has been followed in many states. So I do think that victims also were given a kind of a new level of protection. The other thing is, I thought that it was one of the first times where we had victims that, because we had entered a new age of victims advocacy, and so victims played a very big role in terms of being able to speak out and to speak to the court, talk to the court, and participate in, frankly, the final decisions. I know that in the Idaho case, they made a different decision, but in my case, in our case, I never felt that anything other than the death penalty was on the table. It just couldn't be.
Then we look at, what were the killers outfitted with, and this was kind of eerie. You take a look, as a knife, mask, and gloves, but it's the same K-bar knife that was used. Similar masks were used. Breaking in, they both broke into residences to commit their murders in college towns. Both ended up pleading guilty in these cases. The Gainesville Ripper, though, there was a trial for whether or not he should get the death penalty. BK got a plea deal, and then in the investigation and the prosecution, it was DNA. That was some of the key evidence in both cases. Nate, so when we look at this, Nate Eaton, BK was researching serial killers. It's come to light that Rolling was one of them, but we don't know how many and to what extent yet, do we?
We don't know how many, but we know that he liked Ted Bundy, and there's that photo that came out, I believe, after the trial or right before, or after the plea agreement, of him wearing that hoodie, matching a photo similar to Ted Bundy. And he had been also listening to true crime podcasts, reportedly, and he was obsessed with this type of material. Obviously, he was a student studying this type of thing. The other interesting thing, Vinny, to me is you had Rolling, who was linked to previous homicides that you talked about earlier on in the show, and maybe had some sort of stalking type of behaviors. Brian Kohberger visited that home, or at least the area of the home, some 24 times in the months leading up to the killing. So in a way, was he stalking somebody there? As you mentioned, he hasn't said the motive. He hasn't said the 100% connection between him and the people that were in that home. But there's another similarity between these two.
Let me ask you, Dr. Gary Brucato, you know, the one thing that struck me was the K-bar knife, like the same exact knife. Now, I don't know how common it is for killers to choose a knife like this, but what are your thoughts? I know you've taken a lot of time to really take a close look at this, about whether or not Danny Rolling, the Gainesville Ripper, provided the inspiration or part of the inspiration for BK.
Well, I think there's something else that's important to realize that Danny Rolling had in common with Kohberger, which was an admiration for Bundy. When Danny Rolling was asked in the early 1990s about his motive, his answer was that he wanted to be infamous like Ted Bundy. And realizing that Rolling also was sort of impersonating Bundy is very important, because then the question becomes, what do these two killers that were both being studied by the same individual have in common? Both targeted following rejections by women that they idealized. Both began targeting women who emblematized the women that they were unable to attain, and committed home invasions that involved females that were young and attractive. And interestingly, both Rolling and Bundy were necrophiles. That's very interesting when we realized that the pornography that was found that Kohberger was viewing did include things like sleeping women and drugged women. So we get the sense of an individual who is attracted to the idea, and to offenders who are attracted to the idea, of taking advantage of a person who is sleeping or knocked out or bludgeoned or dead, so that you have total control over them. That weapon choice, incidentally, the K-bar, is fascinating because it's a weapon of war. And one of the points I've been making recently is that I think that's how Kohberger saw himself, as in war against the entire female sex. Anyone who happened to be of the female sex was like wearing the uniform of that team, and therefore was his enemy. And I think he saw himself as kind of delivering a blow to the women of the world. When we realized that these two serial killers had sexual motivations and hated women, it doesn't seem to be too far of a leap to start to speculate about what Kohberger was probably impersonating.